We've got some very important topics to discuss this afternoon. And as you may recall, in the June meeting, there was a lot of conversation. There was a lot of discussion about the weighted add-ons to the SEEK formula, and how long have they been in place, how long has it been since they were reviewed. And when Co-Chair Wise and I met to plan this meeting, we felt it was very important to get the perspective of stakeholders across the education community in Kentucky. So we actually have 6 different superintendents. I don't know if you all, and I know they're here either in person or via Zoom. Do you all have a particular order to go in? What we've got, I think we've got 2 here in person. So why don't you all present in person, and when you come up, please identify yourself for the record, and then we'll go to those who are on the Zoom to talk about this discussion about these SEEK funding model add-ons that are weighted. Thank you so much for being here.
All right, start with introductions. I'm David Gillum, Superintendent, Madison County Schools.
I'm Kyle Lively, Superintendent of Somerset Independent Schools, and we greatly appreciate your time and your invitation to be here. Thank you.
Please proceed.
I think as you guys are aware, and I know you've heard from the task force last week and earlier today with some presentations from KDE and others, as far as SEEK add-ons, I think it's a pretty clear consensus that began around 1990 with the enactment of CARA coming in. And I think the only change that has transpired from that has been about 13 years ago with the English language learners. So obviously it's a funding mechanism that has not been adapted or changed with the times for some years. I do think that obviously everybody in this room cares about education. You want children to have an excellent education, and children across the Commonwealth definitely deserve that. And in order to have an excellent and equitable education, we have to have an adequate and equitable funding system to fund public schools. So I'll turn it over to David.
All right, well, thank you very much, Mr. Lively. And as he said, we certainly appreciate the opportunity to be here. And the great thing about this is we're all joined together for the same purpose, and that is that everyone in this room believes that every child in the state of Kentucky deserves a world-class education, and we want to do everything that we can to get there. So as we mentioned, specifically regarding the weights, when we look at the weights, there are weights for the at-risk students, the special needs students, the ELL, as well as home hospital, and then there is a transportation. So when you look at those 4 things, those are the items that are included. The at-risk is the weight there is a 0.15, and that's for every student that is categorized as free and reduced lunch, economically disadvantaged. Then with the special needs piece, it's divided into 3 different groups based on the need that it takes to how intensive the needs are regarding those students. So we have our speech and language students, which are at a 0.25. Then we have our moderate students, which I think are 1.17, and then we have our severe students, which are our FMD, and our EBD students, and those are a 2.35 weight. And so what the way the weight works, just for your information, is just simply those students are counted at the base rate plus that rate. So if the base funding is $4,000, then the 2.35 is multiplied by that, and that's what we get for those additional students. A couple of points that I would say about that. The first is that by variety of regulations, it takes additional staff for those students. For example, in a regular classroom, we're typically, depending on the grade level, about 30-to-1 teacher-to-student ratio. On students in those severe, the FMD or the EBD courses, classes, the max is a 10-to-1, plus you have to have paraeducator support. So that's the purpose for having those additional weights, simply because those numbers are such. Then so that's the special needs piece. The home hospital is actually a deduct. It's not really an add-on. You get base rate for your students on home hospital minus $100. If you look at the SEEK formula, we get $100 per student for capital outlay. And since those students aren't in school, we deduct $100 because they're not in our buildings. And then the last piece there would be transportation. And transportation is a unique formula. It's pretty in-depth, but it's based on population density, size of your county, and so forth to get a factor, and then you multiply the number of students times that factor to get your actual expected costs to transport the kids. And then it's funded at a percentage. And this, for the past few years, that's been funded at 55%. Okay, so that's just a little bit about that. But I guess the one thing that I would have you all know about a couple of those things is by them being weights, they're multiplied by that base SEEK. And as we have looked at those and reviewed them, the ELL weight is probably, in our opinion, low. When it was first adopted, the prevailing thought among superintendents is that the legislature had a plan to come back and revisit that as they found out more about ELL and ELL students and the needs that they have. But that weight is 0.096, so it's only about additional $375 per kid in funding. So that's a relatively low amount. So that is the one that probably needs to be reviewed as you're looking through this. But again, all of these weights are based on that base SEEK piece. And so one thing that I would say, just as a very important point, is as the base increases, those rates, the actual dollar amounts from those would raise. And as well, I would point to as we look at the SEEK piece. You guys I know you've been talking about this for multiple days, but one thing that I would point out is when you look at SEEK, it has a local component and a state component. And that local component naturally has an inflationary component built in. As property values increase, that local portion increases. And the state portion does not have an inflationary component. The legislature has to act to raise that rate. And so that's because of that, it becomes very important that piece continue and keep up with the inflationary piece. Otherwise, we start to see that get skewed. When you look, for example, also people don't really realize that base SEEK has a deduct for that local effort. For example, in Madison County, the base SEEK is $4,000, but in Madison County, our required local effort is $1,780. So what we are actually funded per kid is not $4,000, but $2,220. So the SEEK formula, it is it's complex, and so sometimes those things get glossed over a little bit. But as you look at that, if you take the base SEEK, which started out as $23.05, I think back in 1990, and you put that into real dollars, in terms of inflation and built that in, it'd be about $4,750 is the estimate today. So, and I'm sure you guys have seen that from some of the financial folks that have testified and discussed that with you. But that's that's the piece that I would throw out there is that base SEEK piece. The formulas seem to work, with the exception of that ELL, seem to work pretty well from my perspective. If that base SEEK increases. Now the transportation, that's a little different discussion there, but that's basically a funding level. So
just to give you an idea on transportation, last year with COVID, and we were in person 133 days, either on an AB schedule or 100% in person. We were at 50,000 miles less. We spent out for 50,000 less miles. We were still only funded at 79.5%. Now, that's high compared to some because we're a smaller independent district, but imagine 50,000 miles the prior year, we were at 63.5%. looking at just general fund and mileage, not trips included in any of that. And as David mentioned, we're also a district in Somerset that has a decently high assessment, which impacts us with SEEK as well. So that base of 4,000 is not actually what's coming into Somerset schools per child. So.
Couple of questions here. It's basically about identifying the students who go into each of these add-ons.
Yes.
Could you expand a little bit about that process? And are there deficiencies in that process, or students? How can we more accurate? Is there a way we can more accurately identify which students need to go in these add-on categories?
Okay. The first in the at-risk, which is identified as free and reduced lunch, that one is not terribly difficult because the students that apply for free and reduced lunch, the downside to that is sometimes we have students that are eligible that we don't get the actual documentation in. But we push that really hard at the school level to try to get that information from them, and are somewhat successful. Because that also impacts our Title I funding and some other federal dollars. So one thing that has complicated that just a little bit is we have had several districts that have applied for the CEP program through Free and Reduced Lunch, the Community Eligibility Program. And when you do that, the benefit for families to fill out the form and send it in is they will get free or reduced lunch. Well, when the whole community is eligible for that, then there's not as big of a motivator for families to send that in. So in a lot of our CEP districts, we've actually seen numbers go down just a little bit, number of free and reduced lunch, simply because we have a more difficult time pulling that in. As far as the students at risk or the exceptional child counts, that one is all of those students are based off of our December 1 child count, and that is something that we would ask that we take a look at and see, because there's a lot of timelines and so forth that have to be met, and we have to take data on students for an extended period of time before they actually qualify. So it is very likely that we've had a student. Every district every year will have students that they have provided services for, that they've worked with for the entire year, but were not able to have that IEP in place prior to December 1, and therefore did not get funding. So if there's any opportunities there to look at ways to count those exceptional child counts outside of just that December 1 child count, that would certainly be appreciated.
Students are migrant, and sometimes special education students are particularly migrant, depending upon need, family circumstances, and other things. So obviously carrying that funding throughout half of year or full year, and obviously it's difficult to predict and to know ahead of time. It's similar with AADA that you're basing it upon the previous year, but it would certainly help to maybe have a little more flexibility with that as far as timelines and getting those numbers in.
Do you have a specific recommendation about when would be a workable timeline, or should it be done twice a year? I mean, what are your specific recommendations about that?
Well, the December 1 timeline is the federal timeline for the IDEA reporting, and so it's very so there's still going to be that push for us to get that data in by then. But if our state, if we had an ability to either one, and the way it works right now is that student is counted. If they're in by December 1, they count all year, and if not, they don't. So if we had a way to potentially prorate that based off of their actual enrollment and tie that back, and through our Infinite Campus system, I think that is very doable. But could increase our funding in that area just off some of those partial students. Yeah,
it could be very similar to the growth factor that we do just for regular AADA or something along those lines, where it is twice or a little later than the December 1.
In essence, what you're saying, if a student comes in the second semester, there'd be a mechanism where you could get that funding for that student if they fall in that category on a prorated basis to the end of the school year.
Yes, sir.
Okay. We have a question from Devonna Page.
It's not really a question so much as he said what I was going to say about the December 1 child count. If you have a student that comes in your district on December 2nd, then you are providing the services to that student for the remainder of the year without receiving any of the funding. And I was going to suggest Infinite Campus was a good way to track those students and determine that amount. My district as well is concerned about the ELL funding. That's an additional $380 per student, which is not adequate to provide the educational services that those students need. In my district, they make up about 5% of our population, which is about 56 kids.
Representative Johnson has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the add-ons, I'm sure, fluctuate from semester to semester, year to year, yet we do a biannual budget. So my question, I'm just trying to understand the process. So my question is, do the fluctuations in these add-ons impact other aspects of the KDE budget or the SEEK budget? Is it a one-size pie and something has to go down if add-ons go up, or does it come out of some other pot of money that impacts the rest of the state budget? How does that work?
I think you make a very good point, and that's the issue with add-ons and SEEK. Until SEEK is increased, you're just going to rob from that pile of money to give to somebody here or take from somebody there. So, but to answer your question, they do fluctuate annually. I can give you just our numbers on home hospital for 2021 were 11 students for us. The previous year, 12. It's not fluctuating greatly, but the numbers do vary. Exceptional child count 2 years ago was 752, 625 last year, and 606 this past year. So those numbers do fluctuate, but I do think that, and maybe Mr. Truesdale or one of my colleagues here could better answer that, but I'm pretty sure that that piece of the pie is going to be shifted from someone to someone else because SEEK is set.
And I would guess that shift or that responsibility is at the district superintendent level. Is that correct? To deal with whatever the fluctuations are?
Yes, the overall budget's the school board and the superintendent's responsibility to make sure that each child's individual needs are met, regardless if those state funds are coming in and are adequate. That local level has to pick up as much of that as possible.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We have a question from Senator Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'm not sure it's so much a question for Mr. Gilliam and Mr. Lively. It's just more of a point of information. In the add-on sheet that I have, there was no mention of transportation, and I know they talked about transportation as being an add-on, and so I'd like to just point out I need something to have in my files about what the impact of transportation on the SEEK add-on formula.
I'll respond to that if you'd like me to. When you look at the we included transportation. When you look at the total SEEK sheet, transportation is an add-on based off of the bottom piece, as are a couple other things. But that one is based off of per pupil and per pupil based off of their transportation status. So we have students that ride occasionally. We have students that are transported every day, and so they have a different transportation code, and our funding is based off of that. So that is a per pupil piece that's adjusted, and when we look at their total dollars in transportation to SEEK, that's there. Yep.
Okay, we've got.
If I may add, Robbie Fletcher, Superintendent, Lawrence County Schools.
Please do.
When you look at transportation funding, it's also it's in comparison to what a like district would be who's considered to be running efficiently. So a lot of times when this is compared, it may not be a dollar per dollar. It's how efficiently are you running your system. I think probably the best person to answer the funding question as far as transportation funding and exactly how it works would be Mr. Che Ritter. He's the gentleman that's responsible for the funding mechanism now. And I see Mr. Truesdale shaking his head. Yes, I think that Mr. Ritter is excellent when it comes to transportation. But if you look at transportation for a larger district or for a county district, you know, for us in the last, let's say, go back to a quote unquote normal year, we spent over like 2.3 million in some areas. And then as far as we're getting funded about 55%. That's pretty common across most districts. But we spent $1.9 million in funding and got $700,000 back. So you're looking at a 1.2 million, but now again, we're getting funded at 55%. It's on a prorated rate based on that efficiency with someone else. So some students, it's a different mechanism for those that are going one way, 1 mile per day, 2 ways, 1 mile per day, versus a student that is going more than 1 mile once a day and more than 1 mile twice a day. So the formula itself is very complicated, and I believe that Mr. Ritter would be the best one to answer that. But something that you're going to see in a larger district, there may be a huge amount of money that's coming from our general fund as opposed to from the SEEK calculations in order to pay for transportation.
I will confer with Co-Chair Wise, but I had thought that we might have a session on transportation funding at some point in the future. And Co-Chair Wise has a comment or question at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you both for being here. I know we've also got Mr. Carter, I think, that's online as well. A couple of questions about each one of your individual districts, if I can ask. And Mr. Lively, I'm near Somerset, being in Campbellsville, been over to your school facilities. Excellent job you guys are doing over there. Being an independent district, we talked about property value, things such as that. What are you seeing in Somerset over the last maybe course of your tenure before? I know you're landlocked, like all independent districts can be. And what have you seen in terms of property value, specifically district? And then, David, if I can as well with you, talk to us about the relationship in Madison County, also with model school, with EKU, and how that affects, if I could, since that's both different questions, but Kyle, I'll let you go first.
In Somerset, we're seeing a lot of growth. To give you an example, a couple of years ago, GE closed. RECC moved out of our district out into the county. That was a $10 million assessment hit off of those two items. We came back last year. The assessments were raised about 15% across the district. We're seeing a lot of growth in Somerset at this time, even though we lost about $10 million last year when we took the 4%. Had we taken the compensating rate as a local district, we would have decreased the tax percentage significantly. And we talk about the 4%. I know you guys are aware of this. It's a 4% revenue increase, not the 4% rate increase. So this past year, we increased the rate. Actually went down in rate. We went from 0.79 to 0.768, but that still generated a 4% tax increase, a revenue increase, while we still decreased the rate. So that should give you an idea of how the assessments are growing and the growth in Somerset, which is great. Sometimes that local effort is carrying a lot. And I looked at our SEEK allocations. We're about 50-50. Actually, SEEK may be $5.8 million, and local revenues are around $5 million. So, and those are not exact numbers. Those are just estimates based upon some things I looked at earlier today. So, the local tax effort is strong, and it continues to grow. And I think that's a great thing. I think it says a lot about Somerset and the area and things that are going on there. But yes, we're seeing the assessments come up, which will increase tax revenues, and hopefully we see more growth. One thing we do struggle with within our limits are housing. There's not a great deal of family homes in our smaller district, and we're not seeing that growth. We're seeing a lot of growth out in the county close to the lake, those subdivisions. So we're really struggling with that to have more, which without homes, the tax dollars are important with that, but more so the student enrollment population coming into that. So while the assessments are going up, downtown is growing, we're still not seeing that boom necessarily in housing availability.
Thanks, Kyle. David?
Yes, in Madison County, we're seeing the same growth there with certainly with property values. And of course, as those go up, if our board does not raise the local rate, if they leave the local rate the same or drop it in order to offset that, even though that's a revenue increase from local sources that offset in SEEK, we get fewer state revenue, so we don't actually grow. Now, we do have Model Lab at EKU in our district. You mentioned that. We have a very good relationship with them for years. They were a part of our district, operated kind of at arm's length, but they were included in our numbers. They are no longer included, except for we do get, they are counted in our numbers to calculate local effort. So we don't have a deduct for those students specifically, because they are Madison County students. And if EKU should at any time choose not to operate model lab schools, we would have to have a place to put those students into to operate them. So.
Thank you both. I'm not sure if any other superintendents that are on with us virtually want to chime in on that same kind of questions about growth and property taxes, but you're more than welcome to.
One of the things too that I want people to realize, and I'm sure everybody does, but just so that it's on record there again, Robbie Fletcher, Lawrence County Schools, the minus effort that from local effort that you receive is basically based on a 30-cent local effort per it's your assessment versus your pupils, and then you get that deduction. For example, after all the add-ons, we still have a deduct of about $1,186. So for a school system that has a high property assessment but low student population, their deduct is going to be a little higher. But if you have a low assessment and more students, your deduct's going to be lower. So there is some in that calculation to try to take care of some of those things. But the local effort, that property assessment is a huge player. As a matter of fact, a huge factor in that formula.
We have one more question from the panel, and then I know we have some superintendents who are online with us. We certainly want to give them an opportunity to share with us. Chuck Truesdale has a question, comment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, first of all, since Mr. Lively already called me out, I'll go ahead and maybe give a more complete response to Representative Johnson's question. As you know, the SEEK budget, when it's done every 2 years, is based on a forecast. So obviously we're not going to get exactly right on all of those numbers. They get pretty darn close, but it's not exact. And so the budget language actually builds in if there's what to do if there's a surplus or if there is a shortfall, and it's never going to happen that you're going to be down to the penny. So there are accommodations, because Somerset's exceptional child count may be higher than forecast, but Madison County's may be lower. And so it tends to all balance out in the end. But they're always refining their methods. The question that I had, and this is for either of you on the panel or anybody else who's going to be speaking, any of the superintendents later on, are there the weights that we have, and you already spoke about the English language learners, they're generally based on historical numbers, and this is the cost to educate students in those cohorts, and they're more than your quote unquote normal students. So that's why the weights are what they are. Do you have any thoughts on other cohorts of students that are more expensive to educate that might merit add-ons in the future? And I'm thinking specifically of things like, we have the add-on for free lunch, but not reduced price lunch. Add-ons for homeless or transient or foster care students, anything of that nature. Are there any groups of kids in your districts that you're seeing have a much higher cost of educating that we may want to think about?
I think you hit a big one there with the reduced lunch. That encompasses a lot of kids that are in that middle of the road, have a semi-support system, but sometimes it takes a little extra effort, and each child comes with unique challenges and also unique talents. So I do think the reduced lunch, as opposed to just the free lunch, would certainly help. To the expenses there with not only remediation, but also enrichment for kids that you want to push. You could look at gifted and talented in some other areas. I know there's some funding for gifted and talented, but that's probably a different conversation. All those diverse bodies of students that have different challenges, certainly looking at the reduced lunch would be nice.
And as well, yeah, certainly the reduced. Of course, when you look at the reduced numbers, across the state would be a large number, but in most districts, it's a small percentage compared to most students either qualify for free or nothing at all. But specifically, they're the foster care, the students in foster care. That is one that could certainly, because those when we were asked to look at this, we basically looked at where do we really see a discrepancy in what it costs to educate this type of child compared to another. And for our foster care students, that is a population that does typically require additional, it's taxing on our counseling services and some of those other pieces. And so that is certainly an area that could benefit. One of the downsides to that is the transiency rate of our foster care students. And when we talk about the transiency that impacts special ed and those numbers, we would have to make sure that we had a formulary piece that was able to track that and to be able to get that in order to make that work. Yeah.
Perhaps basing that on historical data and forecasting would be the best way, because there's probably going to be a trend of that over the course of the years if you have 10 or if you have 200 each year. So I think that would definitely help to have that, because if those kids are coming in and out, they're probably not going to be on your AADA, but they might be the following year.
This is Nick Carter, Superintendent of Breckinridge County. Would it be okay if I speak?
Absolutely. I was just getting ready to ask if any of our online folks want to speak. Please go ahead, Chuck.
Thank you. Mr. Lively brought up gifted education funding, and I'd just like to speak to that because I believe that would need serious consideration. I can speak for in Breckinridge County School District, we receive around $40,000 annually to serve 559 gifted and talented students. And the opportunities for these children are out there, and it's incredible opportunities to help them advance their learning to even greater heights, especially in our rural areas where it's a little bit, it takes a little bit longer. We've got bus transportation to consider to get our children, to get our gifted learners to these opportunities in Lexington and Louisville and Bowling Green and places like that. That is something that we greatly would need to consider if doing so. And I just want to thank everyone for being at the table here. It's great to be a part of this conversation. I appreciate the work that you are doing. Every child in Kentucky deserves an excellent and equitable education, and adequately funding that education is imperative to make that happen. So thank you all for having me, and thank you for engaging in the work.
Superintendent Carter, since you're on the Zoom right now, did you have a presentation or thoughts you wanted to present to the task force while you're on?
Thank you. Well, I've tried to take a few notes to make sure that I don't repeat, because Mr. Lively and Mr. Gilliam did a great job. Obviously, the talk about transportation, I had that on my notes to discuss because of being a county district with over 4,000 miles a day of buses traveling. That is of great concern. And I just wanted I feel like it's important to point out that this last school year that we just concluded in Breckinridge County, we had undergone a major transportation project. We cut 8 routes, and because of the pandemic, because of being AB and things like that, we spent $100,000 less on fuel this school year. However, with all that in place, with cutting 8 routes, $100,000 less in fuel, we still spent $1.8 million on transportation and was funded at just over $985,000. The year before, where we made it to March before we were cut short due to the pandemic, we spent $2.1 million and was still funded at $985,000. So we're right there around that 48 to 54% funding. And this does require, I believe it was spoke to earlier in this meeting, it does, when that much money is coming out of your general fund, it is taking from other services. And so I just appreciate the conversation and folks thinking about it. I believe that having another meeting about just transportation would be very, very helpful. I would like to, we spoke a little bit about special education funding, and I know that there's the IDEA grant and with the federal dollars that I know a lot of folks tend to think that takes care of district special education funding. But I wanted to point out that districts are still covering additional special education costs outside of those federal dollars. Last year in my district, it was an additional $1.9 million out of our general fund to cover the cost. Something else that we talked about a little bit earlier, a few minutes ago, was as those property assessments go up, our state seat dollars go down. Our district, we're usually around that 2 to 3% in assessment growth, and we certainly have felt that hurt as well. Since the 16-17 school year, we've lost just over $1 million in state seat funding, and that's from lower student population to go on top of some assessment growth along. It's all kind of balanced. It's all kind of hit all at once over the last few years. So But that's really what I have. Again, I thank you for coming to the table and having this conversation and just having us be a part of it.
I know we may have, believe we've got some other superintendents online. I know that Robbie Fletcher, who is a member of this task force, is on it. Are there any other superintendents online?
Yes, Paul Mullen, Superintendent of Logan County.
Well, thank you, Paul. I appreciate that. Would you go ahead and share with us, Paul?
Absolutely. First of all, thank you all very much for allowing us to take part of this process, and truly, it's a learning experience for us too. As I sit and listen to what everyone has to say, I don't want to be repetitive. Dr. Carter just gave a lot of really good points that I was going to hit on when it comes to special education and transportation. It's similar numbers for Logan County, about $1.2 million funding from the state. That equals about almost $1 million contribution from the local effort. But the one thing I don't think we've mentioned, and I want to thank you all for providing it in this upcoming budget, is the full funding of kindergarten. And that is extremely important moving forward across the Commonwealth. For us, it's well over $400,000 a year windfall for us that the local effort's not having to pick up. So while we bank on special education that everyone has hit on, along with the transportation piece, which in Logan County is a really big piece, right at $1 million of local contribution, the full funding of kindergarten is something else that I hope that we can sit down and talk about at some point and be able to make that happen moving forward. And once again, thank you all for making that a part of this year's budget, and thanks for allowing us to be part of this task force.
Well, thank you, Paul. And we can't guarantee, you never can guarantee what the General Assembly will do, but I have a bill drafted to make full funding kindergarten permanent. So we'll see how that goes forward. Anybody else online that has not
This
had
is
the
Mike
opportunity to
Borchers
speak
from
yet?
Ludlow Schools.
Yeah, please proceed.
Just a couple things. I know Chuck asked the question about extra add-ons. When you look back in 1990, when CARA was enacted and we created the SEEK distribution formula, I don't think our population was near as transient as it is now. And I don't know that it's possible, but a thought of when you have new students move to your district, some type of add-on, because it takes so much time to onboard and do some special assessments and making sure those students get the needs they want. And I also believe that needs to be a discussion when we talk about our SEEK formula. I know all the legislators are well aware of this, but when you hear $4,000 per student, the reminder is it's still per ADA, not every student of membership. And we're all well aware that there's only so much money. So if you wanted to distribute it per membership, there'd be winners and losers with that. But I do feel that that's something we need to make sure when we're in the discussion of the funding is it's still on our attendance, not on our membership, which for some populations, that can be a big difference. You know, when you're talking your limited ELL students, sometimes their populations aren't as high as the normal population of your school due to various factors of them getting to school and feeling comfortable at school. But those are some things I think would definitely be something to have a little further discussion about the transient populations that are in some of our areas of kids moving districts on a regular basis, which takes a lot of time and resources as well. And I just like to reiterate what all of our colleagues said. We really appreciate you allowing us to be in at the table. The only other thing too, Representative Tipton, is the fact that we do have those line item budgets, you know, when it's instructional resources and PD. I don't know if that'd make it easier on the legislator or harder, but if those became add-ons based on our per pupil, which is how they're derived to begin with, that might be something that keeps budgeting a little easier when you're talking as a superintendent, not knowing year to year if those add-ons or those line items are going to be included in a budget as well. And with that, that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you. Who is that now? Okay. Before we go with that, Robbie Fletcher, I know you're part of this task force. You have anything else you want to add right now? You were on our agenda for this.
Yeah, I spoke a few times about transportation and other items here a little earlier. The only thing that's just to remind the group is, you know, really SEEK is a distribution formula. You know, if we make changes in one area, for example, if we go to ADM, there's going to be winners, there's going to be losers. So we got to be very careful about our unintended consequences when we look at making some type of changes. Now, of course, we all would like to find more funding. Then the distribution formula is a lot easier to work with when you have more funding to move into that. So again, I think everyone's hit on things. I appreciate Superintendent Mullen's talking about full day kindergarten. We're so appreciative of the General Assembly of making that a reality for this past year and for the upcoming year. And we hope that can move forward. But again, our goal, and I think everybody's goal in the room, is to make sure we provide a world-class education for every single student in the Commonwealth, no matter where they're from. And whether it be Eastern Kentucky, Western Kentucky, North, Central, South, wherever. And a lot of it depends on that funding, and the SEEK funding formula serves that basis. It's been a good formula over the years, but as Superintendent Gillen pointed out, it hasn't kept up with inflation. So if there's some things there we could look at moving forward, I'd really appreciate that. And again, I do thank the committee for the opportunity to serve on this committee, and I do thank the three gentlemen that were added today. So we appreciate all the input.
Co-Chair Wise has a question, comment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a comment, maybe could turn into a question, but as we talk about attendance versus membership, as we come out of COVID-19 with the past year, the number of students with online learning, has your district started to formulate virtual academies to set those up for parents and children who went through the virtual learning style, maybe did well? Some did well, some did not thrive in it, but I think the nature of education is changing. It will continue to change as it always does. But with that, will your district be offering virtual learning academies for online learning only as an option for students that want that type of learning? Personally, as a parent, my children thrive best as in-person learning. I think that's the best learning. I'll say that. We don't all have to agree or disagree. But where are you all in terms of, if we look at attendance versus membership, if there is online learning modules that develop, what's the thoughts out there with superintendents?
In Madison County, we are offering a virtual option for next year. This previous year, we gave parents a couple of options, the ability to attend in person whenever we had in person, or the ability to go declare virtual for the whole year. And we had about 800 students a little over 800 that wanted virtual all year long. For this coming year, we have about 80. So it's about 10% of what wanted it this past year. So overwhelmingly, our folks prefer in person. That's what they want. But that online option is a good option for some families. Yeah.
At Somerset, we are not. We felt like we were kind of at a crossroads, looking at the high volume of failures that we had, particularly at the high school level, just non-participation on some parts. Now, some students can excel, and a lot of times those are going to be your gifted and talented kids, or some kids that may have some social emotional things. But we discussed it as an administrative team and with the Board of Education. We kind of felt like we can better care for their social, emotional, educational needs within the building. Furthermore, it extends us maybe outside of our range with the smaller districts sometimes, because having to actually do an in-person online course versus the Google Classroom, setting that up and doing some things, requires more staffing. So we wanted to focus on, can we get kids back in the buildings, get those routines established, and check on them, feed them, and make sure that they're doing well. Because while it was a great experience, our teachers excelled, the administrators did a good job, we just didn't feel like this year was the year to look at that. Now, it's changing. Obviously, I'd say most of the individuals in this room took a college course online, and in a lot of ways, that's good. So those are things we're going to have to consider moving forward. It's just going to, can we provide the staffing for that, and then what's the impact going to be for kids, and then are we teaching some bad habits by not having some required in schools?
Senator Wise, in Breckinridge County, we'll be offering an online academy for grades K through 12. Right now, we've got less than 100 that's signed up. Another note to point out, we are having several traditional homeschool families that we're welcoming into the district through our online learning academy for this school year. So we're really excited about that, and working with those families to help meet their needs to be a part of the public school district.
I'll go next. Again, Robbie Fletcher, Superintendent of Lawrence County Schools. We are offering a virtual academy for 6 through 12. It's more asynchronous with supports through a computer program. And K through 5, we're following the virtual academy model, where we're actually hiring additional teachers to teach online and be online with students at least at least twice a day to deliver instruction. The difficult part of that is, it's hard to find a teacher that might be able to do. We probably might have to hire somebody to do kindergarten and first grade, another teacher do second and third grade, another teacher do fourth and fifth grade. We're looking at about a little less than 80 students total. We did offer 3 options last year. We offered a synchronous option with students going on at the same time. And many of us in our schools, we had teachers that were teaching students in front of them and teaching students at home. That was the most difficult thing I've ever asked a teacher to do at the same time, was to do synchronous learning with kids at home, kids at school. So now we're actually hiring a separate educator that would do the at-home learning. So yes, in Lawrence County, K through 5, it's going to be more screen time. That's the tough part. It's going to be more screen time for those K through 5 kids, whereas 6 through 12, there'll be some screen time, but it's more asynchronous than what it's more along our option 3 from last year.
Paul Mullins from Logan County. Ours mirrors both Dr. Carter's and Dr. Fletcher's program, and I'm going to say our numbers are around 80 as well the last time I checked, and it's K through 12.
Mike Fortress from Ludlow, kind of similar to Superintendent Shively. Being a small district, we had 96% of our students in all year. Last year, almost 98% of our elementary. We have had the last few years a performance-based online model, and that's an individualized program where we meet with the families and create a program for them center-wise. So we're continuing with that, but based on all of our data and the feedback we receive from our parents, they want students here in the building in a small setting. Our class ratios are 20-to-1 at the highest. So they really like that individualized attention. And if they don't have a situation that works for them, we'll do an individual program as we see need fit.
We now have a question from Representative Bojanowski.
Oh, thank you. So I was just kind of reflecting on average daily attendance versus average daily membership. I'm a special ed elementary teacher, and I know that the students in my building who struggle with attendance are also the students who have much more significant educational needs. Even to the point where poor attendance is an exclusionary factor. I've had a student who was really struggling academically, but because his attendance was so poor, he didn't even qualify for special ed. So just kind of my insight into, and I wondered about that, are we, maybe you get a little bit of an add-on, but then if those same students do not attend, do you have what you need to educate them? So just my thoughts from down in the trenches.
Mm-hmm. And I would agree with that. In some ways, that the ADA is somewhat counterintuitive because, as you mentioned, students who are absent more frequently, it takes more attention to bring them back, to provide remedial services, and as you referenced there, the missing those abilities to identify them as special needs, or at least delaying them. And I mentioned the December 1 child count. That's a piece that can impact that. So I think what we have looked at as superintendents, in the big scheme of things, when you look at holistic numbers across a district, our ADAs are within a percentage or two of each other in most cases. And so if you shift from one to the other, it probably would not shift the net amount of funding very much to our districts, but certainly excellent points there, Representative.
And I do think because we have those fixed charges, those reoccurring expenses, payroll, teachers are already under contracts for the year, classified if it's a one-to-one instructional assistant already under contracts. So those expenditures are going to be there regardless of how much money is coming in. So great question.
A few of us here attended the Southern Legislative Conference last week and had education committee meetings there. And one of the comments that was brought up is that we saw a 3% drop in enrollment in public schools last year. I know COVID and all that impacted. I read articles that our birth rate in the country is decreasing. What are you all seeing as far as student enrollment and projection for student enrollment? And I ask that question because you've got certain fixed costs there. You have to maintain them regardless of how many students are in the district. are you seeing what kind of trends are you all seeing in your areas and across the state?
Well, I'll jump in. Madison County, we sit right on I-75, and so we are seeing some growth. It's been slight. It's been slowing in the past few years, and that as I've kind of looked at that, it really appears that our birth rate in the county has slowed. So people are having fewer children, but our increase in student population is coming from people migrating from the eastern Kentucky counties mainly. So we're seeing migration into our county because we sit right on I-75, but we are not growing as fast for the last 2 to 3 years as what we did 10 years ago, 15 years ago. We were growing very, very quickly. You mentioned the 3% drop last year. We saw that across the state. In most cases, in a lot of cases, we saw an increase in students declaring for homeschool. They were going to be home. If they were going to be home, they just moved them to homeschool if they didn't like exactly the program that we were offering. So
we're seeing the same thing in Somerset, particularly last year. I think you had a lot of families who had kindergartners as well that decided, I don't want to be in and out of school, so I want my young one to have consistency in their first year of kindergarten. The other thing is prior to that, we were fluctuating around 1,600, 1,630, and then we would drop to 1,580. Last year was really low. That was the lowest year attendance that we've had in the 7 years that I've been at Somerset. And I do credit a lot of that to COVID. Hopefully in the future, moving forward, that continues to creep back up to 1,600. But as I discussed with Senator Wise earlier, I think a lot of that is the housing issues that we face too in Somerset, where there's not a lot of family homes that are being newly built. So.
Do any of our superintendents online have any thoughts on that?
Yes, in Breckinridge County, our enrollment has been flat or decreasing slightly for a few years. And as a county, our population's been kind of in the same boat. So we've certainly have experienced that as well.
Robbie Fletcher again, Lawrence County. The eastern part of our state, as you well know, there's been mass exodus over the years. Lawrence County was one of the few districts that grew back in the 2014 to 2017 range, but then we've been decreasing since. So for us, we have a decrease in population, or a decrease in the number of students that we have in our schools. And I think you're going to find that more common in most of the eastern part of our state. As a matter of fact, if you go to Lexington, Georgetown, or maybe even Madison County, it's hard not to find an Eastern Kentuckian there right now. So, or a large part of Eastern Kentucky there.
Paul Mullins, Logan County. Once again to say what everyone else is saying, our numbers are flat with a slight decrease trend projected over the next 4 to 5 years.
Mike Borchers from Ludlow. About 4 years ago, we went through a change in our community. We're a bedroom community. And when the housing market shifted, we had a lot of houses that had been split into apartments and they've been rebought and remodeled. And we've gone into the one family houses and we had a pretty big drop, but now it's became very stable. And being on the river right by Cincinnati, we have 2 huge developments moving in due to the fact of the urbanization. And we're starting to see an uptick in attendance, and we're trying to make sure we're ready for that when that comes. It's about 1.5 years away from finalizing the building.
Appreciate your response to that, and that question led into my next question. And we discussed this last month in the task force. We're seeing large population shifts in our state from the east and the west to this golden triangle area. And as a result of that, the communities that are losing population are also losing the appreciation in property values, whereas the districts that are gaining, have jobs, are seeing a much greater appreciation in property values, and that's where we get these great discrepancies in local effort. And I think talking to some people, it causes consternation. You understand what depending on where you're coming from. And I guess I'm just asking, maybe I'm grasping, but I'm asking, do you have any thoughts on how can we address that? Because we've got a responsibility to educate our children no matter where they're at. and these counties that obviously we want people to move to those counties. But in light of that, we've got counties that are reducing numbers of students. You've got the continued fixed cost. Any ideas or thoughts about how we can move forward and come with a more equitable solution to that? I'm just asking. I'm throwing out an idea there. Food for thought.
Turn my mic back on. I would point back to the to those two pieces that I made. The point I made earlier on the inflationary piece, that local effort piece has grown at an inflationary rate which has outpaced the total piece. So that makes that a bigger component of that, and so then it skews it. So I would point to that. But as far as how do you fix that? That is a good question, and that is particularly problematic. And you point to, and it actually creates a little bit of an issue on both sides, because certainly you've got, if people are leaving an area, you have buildings that you still have to keep up and so forth. But at the same time, you're talking start to finish it at least 5 years before between the time you start planning a school and the time that you can actually put a kid in that school. So that creates issues as well on those counties that are growing. So.
I realize that was maybe an impossible question to answer, but I just wanted the issue to be out there, so we're thinking about it. My last question.
I'm sorry, sir.
Go ahead, Robbie, if you want to interject, please.
I appreciate that. And this is probably a topic for another time, but you're absolutely right. That is a huge question. It's going to take a lot of research from a lot of good minds in the room to how do we handle that. I think Superintendent Gillum has hit on some good points. But also one other thing I want us to keep in mind, and this is definitely a conversation for another day, is nickel calculations. For a lot of districts across the Commonwealth, they've tried desperately to get that additional nickel. And right now, and I've mentioned this before, you can't get matching funding unless you have that additional nickel. So, there's many schools across our state that are in that bottom 50, bottom 100 that desperately need renovations, or maybe not renovations, just replaced. For example, we have a building in our district that would cost about around 85% of what it would cost for a new construction, but we still don't have the bonding capacity because we don't have that additional nickel and the matching funds for it. And we're just one example of many like that. Lee County would be another one that jumps out. I know they tried at least 4 times for the nickel tax and are unable to get it. So something that as we move forward, if we could talk a lot about how to handle nickel taxes and things like that, I would greatly appreciate it too. And that would be something that's an add-on, if you will.
Could I add one thing too? This is Mr. Mike Fortress from Ludlow.
Please go ahead.
I think when you're talking about our tax rates, there's also an inequity in those local tax rates to where, I don't know a perfect answer, but to where there would be some type of ceiling for the tax rate or floor, and then a ceiling. And if a district's taxing over that ceiling, they're able to keep more locally. And if the other districts that are below that floor increase, that would allow some more money to be spent from the state in different areas as well. So something to the effect of where that local tax base becomes somewhat of an equitable number across the state. I don't know that that's a perfect answer, but for some of us that have a real high tax rate, the discussion is some folks maybe locally aren't able to do that. And if you do have a high tax rate and your district's trying to do a lot of things, maybe they don't have to do as much on the local, less 30-cent local effort after you get above a certain tax rate. Once again, it would take a lot of discussion and a lot of research, but that could be something that would work within our current constraints that may give districts some more flexibility, and the state as well.
Representative Tipton,
please go ahead.
Go back to your first question. I don't know if there's been a study done lately about funding and possible solutions. The last one that I'm aware of was by the Council for Better Education back in 2014. But that I can certainly see why you would ask that question, and it might be that might be something to do for us to have a study or some type of a report on to get some input on how to develop a system to address these concerns.
Thank you for your comments. And I have one additional question, and it's not really direct, not really about our subject, but it's a comment I've had with I've heard from superintendents over the year, and it certainly impacts our total discussion. Last month we talked about the SEEK formula, the SEEK calculation. This month we've addressed the non-SEEK formula, and I have had superintendents make the comment to me, we would prefer less line item budgeting, an increase in the SEEK formula, so we have more local control over how we meet the needs at the local level. Would any of you all like to share thoughts or comments on that?
I think having the ability and the flexibility to spend those funds as we see fit. We've talked about a lot of this is a forecast. Real life happens day to day, so as much flexibility that we can have at the local level with that would certainly be advantageous, not only to the district but more so for kids, because there's funding available to meet their individual needs. I think that having line item things, for example, the flex focus funds are great, but if those were just added in to the SEEK calculation and we're able to spend that on anything that we need, if another pandemic hits, hopefully it doesn't, we have some funds readily available that we can spend that toward. If a roof goes out and we don't have the bonding capacity to do some things, we have general funds available. While that money should be spent on textbooks, instructional supplies, and all those things, if the roof's leaking, it doesn't matter what kind of textbooks or laptops you have in there and if you can't fix the roof. So I think that would be greatly appreciated just to have that added in rather than a line item.
I would agree, absolutely. I think the prevailing piece there is trust. Okay, and when you line item pieces, it signals that we don't trust you to spend this in the way that is most needed in your district. That we have a specific intent, and that's how we want you to spend it. And I understand that. I certainly do. But at the same time, perhaps there was a day across the Commonwealth where superintendents didn't act in the best interest of kids in certain cases. But I think that day has passed us. I truly do. I believe that if you, when you guys get out and talk to a group of superintendents, or groups of principals, or groups of teachers across the Commonwealth, you know how hard they're working for kids, and so all of the flexibilities that we could be provided would certainly be appreciated. And as well with that, I think if you look at one specific piece that's been mentioned here 2 or 3 times is the construction funding with the funds that are specifically dedicated to certain construction projects. That is, we understand the purpose behind that and the designation of those taxing pieces, but when that occurs, the result of that is big discrepancies in districts. I think if you really weighed out the discrepancies in districts, facilities would be the widest area of discrepancy. And as Dr. Carter mentioned, there are areas in our state that, or maybe Dr. Fletcher, but there are areas in our state where districts can't build a school, where they can't replace a school, and there are other areas just right across the county line where they can. And that's not building that fair and equitable system, world-class education system we want for our kids in Kentucky. So that's what I'd say about that. Thank you.
Any of our other superintendents have any comments on that?
I would just agree with that comment that you made, Mr. Tipton, that anything that can stay in the SEEK formula, it becomes a yearly forecast that we know is going to be there as a superintendent, makes planning a lot easier. I know that might make it harder on the legislators, but I do feel that if it was in the SEEK funding, we know that that's something we can plan on based on our population size versus if line items are going to be in there for 2 years or not. And that would allow us a lot more flexibility than we are given right now.
I will add from a General Assembly perspective, I don't know if trust, another word besides trust might be accountability, that with these funds, we need to make sure that we are accountable to our citizens or taxpayers that they're being spent. And the question on that is how do we find that right balance on that? Yes. So just a question I wanted to get some input on. Anybody, if there are no other questions, we'll move on to our final agenda item. Appreciate you all being here today. I told Dr. Pruitt this morning we were saving the best for the last. But pleased to have a presentation from President of the Southern Regional Education Board. For you who don't know, that I'm sure everybody understands here, but somebody's watching online. Kentucky is a member of the Southern Regional Education Board, and I'm sure President Pruitt can elaborate on their role, but they've been a great partner in providing information and policy analysis. So, President Pruitt, please introduce yourself for the record and proceed with your presentation.
Got it. Thank you for having us. You'd think I'd know how to do that by now. I'm Stephen Pruitt, President of the Southern Regional Education Board. It's good to be back here. It's always good to be in the bluegrass. It's great to be in this seat, knowing that I'm here to just give you information and not how y'all used to have to grill me a little bit. But it's always great to be with you and to be part of a way to help you with what you guys are talking about. Before I jump into this too much, I'd be remiss if I just didn't pause for just a second. I know y'all acknowledged in this morning, but this is probably going to be the only chance I will get to say anything publicly about BAM. And so BAM was a dear friend, both to the Commonwealth and to me. In fact, my 2 darkest days of my career, BAM was there. When the shooting at Marshall County happened, it was actually during his committee meeting, and I stepped out, and there was a lot of information going back and forth, but it always stands out to me that BAM texted me and asked how I was doing. Second darkest day, I won't go into the details about what that was exactly, but some of you might can figure it out, but he was there. Physically, he just came and he sat with me and made sure that I knew he supported me and that others did too. He was a genuine guy, and I think that's about as good as any of us could ever say about anybody. Is he was genuine. He cared about people. We didn't always agree, especially when he tried to tell me that I was good enough to play golf with him, but he was a good guy, and we've lost a good one here in the Commonwealth. And so I don't know that I'll get a chance to ever say that anywhere else, so I figured I'd take a moment of privilege here. So I appreciate you indulging me on that. Did you share screen already? All right. Thank you, sir. I am going to share with you. Not sure why it didn't actually go into presentation mode there, but I want to share with you a little bit about how things look regionally. I'm going to tell you a few things just to kind of set some context, and then we'll go a little bit more into the weighted aspects of this, because I know that's the real purpose of today's meeting. But what I will tell you is, and just to start things off and set a little context, some of you have heard me say this. In fact, I think I may have actually said what I'm about to say sitting in this chair. Education is not rocket science, because rocket science is actually easier. Now, given I'm a chemist, so maybe it's not a completely fair comment, but it's awfully hard and it's awfully complex. And the things that you talk about here, they're dealing with humans, they're dealing with a lot of different nuances that tend to be a little bit more complex than what we deal with in a lot of other things. Education funding is just as bad. I've always made the joke that you couldn't when I was here, it couldn't be Chuck, Robin, Charlie, and Shay be in the same car, because the original idea of the designated survivor was that one of those 4 needed to be not in the same car in case they got hit by a truck, because they were the ones who understood the formula best. And so it gets to be very complex. In fact, I'm even going to share some numbers with you today and I'll try to remember to point out to you, from our perspective at SREB, when we're looking across the region, in Kentucky and Georgia, it's a little different because I'm very familiar with both of those funding structures. But when I'm doing these presentations, we tend to have to stay at what the legislated amounts are. That doesn't mean that what goes on under the hood is actually quite as specific, and I'll try to point that out. So we have seen across the region where this is becoming more and more of a conversation. And there are actually 3 states I'm going to point out to you today about their process and how they worked. But I want to set a little context for you on the outset. I think everybody knows who we are, but just to be safe, Southern Regional Education Board has been around since 1948. We were created literally by you. We serve at your pleasure. Now, maybe not every state that calls automatically gets me to come, but Kentucky does. It will always be home. Flying into Louisville yesterday, I didn't have a nostalgic feeling. I just felt like I had landed back home. And so it's great to be back for that. But the governors and legislatures back in 1948 created us to help support and create a more viable economy through education. And so you're being a member of SREB means that when you need something, we come do it for you. We are fiercely nonpartisan. We do whatever we have to do to support good quality policy. But at the end of the day, we're going to let you guys fight it out when it comes to the politics. But we'll tell you what the research says. Now, some considerations as we go into this are, if you want to go down the road of actually thinking about how to change your formula, these are some things that you really need to have some conversation about. And I want to point out that if you really want to do something with this, this is a long-term discussion. This is not something that you can do in a session. It's probably not something you should do in a year. It takes some time. Now, trust me, as a former commissioner of education, at best, sometimes it feels like we move just a little faster than glaciers. I mean, it feels, and I know that we want to do what's good for the kids right now, but there's time and consideration for good reason. First of all, if you're going to think about this, and you're going to see in the states that I identify for you in a moment, you've got to first start with, what are your goals? What do you want education to be? Representative Tipton, your question about having fewer students. By 2030, for the first time, the United States is going to have more age-dependent individuals than they do working age. For every 52 age-dependent individuals, that's not disabilities, that's people who are below 18 and above 65. For every 52 of those, only 48 are actually in the workforce. That means that you're going to have fewer people paying in for things like Social Security. It means but what it also means for you is you're going to have fewer students in school. It's just, the math just doesn't work unless we have another baby boom. So what do you want the goals of education to be in Kentucky? Given that statistic I gave you, part of that's got to be, what do you want your workforce to look like in Kentucky by 2030? You're going to have to think about winners and losers. Right now, you've got, it's just a practical issue. You've got winners and losers in the current system. Your losers, you hear from a lot. And of course, losers, what I mean here is they don't feel like they're getting the funding that they need. The winners, you probably hear a little less from unless you get a kudos every now and then. But this is why you've got to really take into account what any change you make looks like. You're going to have to think about unintended consequences. One of the things that a lot of states have done, and one in particular, is they're constantly running new prognostications and modeling about what the funding might look like. When we did our ESSA plan when I was commissioner here, I actually had a whole committee called the Unintended Consequences Committee. And their job was to tell me how they would skirt anything they could skirt in the ESSA plan. And you're kind of going to have to think about it here too. A big consideration is going to be anything regarding transition. This is not going to be something that you can flip a switch on. Because if you do flip a switch, you're going to have a lot more losers than you do winners, at least in a short term. So let's just look at a few comparisons across the region. first of all, it's important to understand out of the beginning here that we refer to these as funding formulas, but there's really a difference between an allocation formula and a funding formula. Okay? And it's important to understand that, because an allocation formula means you have a set of money and you have put it into the formula and it is allocated out. If you go with a funding formula, then you actually have to go through the rigors of what would it cost to educate a child, or at least what your estimates would be, and then you fund based on that. Let's be honest. In the practical world of state government, that approach is pretty much impossible without major restructuring, and frankly, it may not even be completely possible. But I point that out because as you're making considerations about changes here, it's a system of a formula, which means that when you determine your amount, tweaking that may not get you where you need to go. It may be that it's good the way it is. Maybe you put more money in because it's an allocation formula versus the actual funding. Now, our states in the South, they typically have two different labels. And they think about it and all of them basically are allocation formulas, but it's kind of subdivided into resource-based versus student-based. So in Alabama, Delaware, and Tennessee, and West Virginia, you basically see what's considered a resource-based. So this is a formula that determines the cost of delivering education in a district based on the cost of resources, with everything from salaries to course materials and so on. This is, it works to varying levels of quality, I guess you could say, or contentment, but it does actually present some challenges as a budget is being developed every year or every other year. Nationwide, excuse me, I'm fine, I've been vaccinated, just want to point that out. Yeah, I'm about to get some. But the resources in this, basically you're setting this up, and then you do have some type of categorical funding that goes along with this. Nationwide, you got about 26% of the state funding in these states is run through a categorical grant. So in other words, they come up with this base amount, and then they do a category on top of that. Now, a student-based funding formula, which of course Kentucky has in terms of SEEK, Arkansas, Florida, Kentucky, Maryland, Oklahoma, and Texas all have similar structures in terms of this. Oh, thank you so much. But basically it's setting up a per pupil basis that is a student that doesn't have some type of special need, whether it be actual special needs services or whether it be low income or whether they're gifted or whatever. It's kind of this base number. Let's face it, this is also one of the things that gives you a good feel, but it also is one of those things that makes things a little bit complex. I know that in my time here, it was very difficult at times to explain to people who weren't in the legislature or in the middle of all this, when they would read a headline that says SEEK is at $4,000 per student. And it wasn't that every student got $4,000, because you also have equalization. So in Jefferson County, it's going to look very different than, say, Robertson County. So in doing that, of course, I won't spend any more time on that because these states are all very similar in that regard. Now, we do have some states that actually have more of a hybrid. Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, they combine a base student cost with some pretty extensive program allocations. So they have I would say it's probably a more robust version of LARS items, where they actually are able to kind of pinpoint various things. Now, historically, Kind of going back to the conversation you just had, some of it might be making sure that money gets put in the right place. Some of it might have been the fact that it just aligned better with their priorities. Now, when we look at different model types across our SREB states, you basically have a foundation program versus a tiered funding program. Here, these states, they basically have where they have set a per student guarantee from the state in terms of state and district funding. So they're kind of guaranteeing this bottom line. From a tiered funding perspective, there's a foundation program plus equalization. Of course, Kentucky is in this. So in the first case, the headline would be $4,000 per student, and that's exactly what they're getting. And then there are things on top of that. With tiered, there's a bottom line, and then we actually look at equalization in terms of what your local base is. And actually, North Carolina, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a moment, they actually they're kind of unique. You could arguably say they are literally unique, or they're one of 7 in the country that do it this way. It is basically a hybrid model, but it contains funding or base funding, student-based allotments, district-based allotments that has a supplemental funding for low wealth and small counties, and they have program-specific grants. I will share with you that what we're seeing in some of our other states, I haven't seen it in Kentucky yet, and if any of the superintendents here want to catch me later and let me know, but we're actually seeing some rural districts in the country that are actually not getting any of the federal stimulus money because they didn't even qualify. There were so few students they didn't qualify for title funding. So they are kind of getting hit with a double whammy there. North Carolina is not doing that, but they do recognize those really small districts, and they actually give them a little bit of extra funding. Now, to the thing that you guys really wanted me to talk about most, but I thought it was important to give you a little bit of an overview, is about weighting factors. When it comes to low income factors, we see in several of our states where there is a specific weighting factor with regard to low income students. Now, there again, this kind of gets back to whether it's a per pupil versus a formula. But in these states, there have been some very specific attempts to recognize that there are low-income students and large concentrations of those students in various parts of the state. In terms of district poverty, Florida, Maryland, Texas, and Virginia actually look at basically the district's ability to raise their own tax. That there's actually, there are, especially some of our more rural districts, I know when I was here, there were some districts that when I would go visit them, they'd say, well, we could raise tax, but they're not able to pay their tax now. So if we raise it another nickel, it's not really helping us a whole lot. And in these states, there's kind of this recognition that poverty level exists. And there's some argument, especially in some of these states, most recently Maryland and Texas have revised their formula. And some of the argument was with that greater investment, hopefully they can bring more industry, and by upgrading the schools there to bring more industry to those areas and go into that cycle or that wheel. In these states, there's specific weighting for students with disabilities. I'm going to point out here one subtle difference with kind of what goes on in Kentucky, because this has always been a little bit close to my heart, is around gifted and talented funding. And obviously, especially with the fact that I'm the former superintendent of the Kentucky School for the Deaf and for the Blind, I'm all about this. I believe that we've got to, because it does literally cost more to educate a student with a disability. But, we also do have, the excellence gap that people talk about a lot. And in Kentucky, there was the choice to actually, make this one of the line items as opposed to having it in the SEEK formula. Several of the other states actually include that in their SEEK formula alongside of a student with disability. weight. There's a district taxed effort. Of course, Kentucky is in here too, but several of our states across the South also weigh that into effect. Again, this kind of gets into the equalization aspect. I'll talk in a minute about one of our states, Texas, as they've revamped theirs. I don't know who started it, but they kind of jokingly, without joking, calling the Robin Hood effect, and stealing from the rich and giving to the poor. Although I think it's kind of an interesting redundancy, because while they call it that, they still are also investing in districts that clearly have high poverty. We also have several districts here that specifically invest in small districts. Of course, in Kentucky, in fact, it was actually interesting. I got a call from Duke University just last week. They're doing some research in Kentucky around the compensatory age and when that changed, and they just couldn't figure out how. Well, they sent me a question, and I answered it, and I used, at the time, 173 school districts, and they couldn't figure out how we had 120 counties and 173 school districts. So I had to, so I had to get on a call and explain independent schools and and all that, and they got it. But these states actually specifically support those districts. Now, these are the 16 SREB states, and you can see Kentucky there in blue. To my Louisville friends, I apologize. SREB is a blue color. It's in our color wheel, so please don't take that as me, throwing shade at Louisville. But that's where you guys sit in terms of local versus state versus federal. Now, this is actually one of those examples, though, of when you're at our level looking at a 30,000-foot level across the region. This is a good chart, but there is a nuance in this chart. And that nuance is that state allocation also includes the oh my gosh, I just went blank. The on behalf ofs. Thank you. So the actual money that's going to district operations toward operations in classrooms, arguably it's probably less than 56.3, but because this is looked at from what the budgets are passed, that's basically where you see. Now you can see local, Virginia is the high at 53.7. State percentage is highest in North Carolina, and the federal is actually in Mississippi. Now, the interesting thing about this is, and I was always real leery of this, that, once your federal starts to get a little high, there's multiple ways for there to be extensions of the U.S. Department of Education, and one of them is when they're paying for more. And so that's something to be aware of. But you can see on this chart kind of where Kentucky sits. It's, it's pretty well situated, I think, in most of these, but obviously there would be more conversation that you guys need to have. Now, what I'd like to end with is to share with you 3 states that have recently gone through a change in their funding formula. Texas in 2019 actually passed new legislation. They had actually been experiencing multiple lawsuits saying that the finance system had actually eroded and was not providing equitable education. They actually set a commission on public school finance. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. There are some states, and one I live in right now, that set up multiple blue ribbon committees, and at the end of the day, they decided that we really don't need to change a whole lot. And that's fine. That's not me being critical of anybody. It's just a reality. But it all does depend on how you approach that conversation. And the way Texas did it, and you'll see the same thing in Maryland, the way they approached it actually made for better conversation. So they started with this commission. It was established in 2017. There were 15 meetings in 2018. The commission finally yielded their final report in December of 18. And then in January of 19, they filed House Bill 3. So it took a couple of years, and it was thoughtful. And you'll see in a second what I mean by that. And you can see where they talk about their Robin Hood equalization. So they developed recommendations based on these things. Now, I'm going to sum this up in a little bit, but I'm going to put a little exclamation point on this. Okay, remember I talked about 5248. You've got to start by thinking about what do you want your citizenry to look like in the future. So if you're going to change something, what's the goal? So they actually started with what's the purpose of our financing system? What do we want to see out of this? They specifically looked at the relationship between state and local funding. They looked at what would an appropriate level for local effort look like that would comply with their state constitution. And then what policy changes, adjusting to different student demographics and diversity would they need to deal with to make sure that they didn't continue to have these lawsuits. So in House Bill 3, when it was passed in 2019, it reduces property tax to a foundation fund. It limits their local property tax increases. And it eliminates the cost of education index, which was a focus that they had there for a long time. It increased state funding to economically disadvantaged schools. So while they didn't like the Robin Hood, basically what Texas said was, well, all right, we're not going to take money away from the affluent districts, but we're going to invest more in the districts of poverty. There was a new allotment for fast-growing districts. So they actually took and looked at the longitudinal data and saw, well, this district has more people moving in. There are new industries that are coming here, whatever, and so there was a specific allotment placed for that. They increased allotments for transportation, dual credit, dual enrollment, and work-based learning opportunities. Those are things that in Kentucky have been both supported and pushed for a long time. And then the big one was that they actually now have required statewide full-day pre-K, with the idea being that if they're going to change their literacy, they're going to have to get started earlier than kindergarten. When it comes to educators, I just want to point this out. When you guys are considering whatever you're going to consider, remember education is a system. We call it an education system. And I point that out. Now, I'm a science guy. And I point that out because when we think of systems, you got to know that whenever you tweak something in one part of a system, it affects the other part of the system. We have a nationwide teacher shortage issue. And so when Texas took a look at this, they also looked at their teaching force. Now, I'm going to share with you that it's my personal belief the teacher shortage is not an education issue. It's actually a workforce issue. But when you're thinking about how education funding affects education in your state, you do have to look at your workforce. So they increased their minimum teacher salary. There's a minimum percent of year-to-year per student allotment that increases teacher salary. They created a teacher incentive allotment, the possibility for teachers to earn six-figure salaries. And there's an establishment of a teacher mentoring program with dedicated funding allotment. That one may sound a little familiar from something that we had a few years ago here. Now, in Maryland, there was they called it the Kerwin Commission, and it's their blueprint for Maryland's future. Actually, Senator Wise is working with us right now on a joint project that we have with NCEE and NCSL, where we're meeting together. In fact, we have a meeting tonight where we're looking at what other countries are doing, as well as and trying to find ways to help states with meet their own needs. This was based on that first round of this type of work. And so they spent a long time working on this. And my personal belief is this is as close to CARA as we've seen since CARA. They went through and looked at everything, and basically they are recreating this. In fact, to implement this, they're looking at a 10-year timeline to really get this implemented properly. I mean, talk about planting the seed of the tree whose shade you may never sit under. I mean, this was a pretty radical thing, and frankly, I think a pretty courageous thing. So what they did, the charges of the commission. So now remember I said you got to have a goal. You got to have priorities. So what did they do? They said, well, what are our charges? Review and recommend needed changes to update the formula and make policy recommendations enabling Maryland's pre-K to 12 system to perform at the level of the best performing school systems in the world. They set a goal. It was a lengthy process. It started in 2016. The preliminary report was in 2018. The final report was in 2019, and they just passed it in 2020. And so it starts implementation in 2021. It was House Bill 1300. It requires $4 billion annual state and county spending above the current spending program. Now, in fact, I will tell you that the governor there did veto this bill, and it was because of concerns of the money. The legislature actually overrode it. This was a pretty down the middle bill. It was pretty well embraced clearly by both sides of the aisle. So there are points to consider. They identified big policy buckets. They identified the cost to change, and then they considered the funding formula. In other words, if you dive right into the weeds on the formula, you're going to create new winners and losers, and you're going to create unintended consequences. So before they went to the formula, they said, let's think about what the cost of these changes are. So the commission really kind of blended this approach to look at adequate funding, but they did it based on what other states doing and what other countries have done. For them, this is their infographic of how to do this. They based it on wealth of the district, equity of making sure that each district receives appropriate funding, and what their enrollment was. In Maryland, they do not do ADA, they actually do enrollment. They looked at the per pupil weights. They wanted to reflect ongoing resources that were needed by a specific population of students. They looked at what the guaranteed tax base was, and then they looked at the wealth, an equalized wealth formula, but they also include some categorical state funding as well. Now, the categorical state funding is great, except we also know that's what tends to get hit when you start having to do budget reductions. I know that when we had a big budget reduction when I was here, the first thing I did was I asked Robin and the crew and Charlie to go into Munis and say, tell me every line item that doesn't have people, and we'll cut that first. I hated having to cut professional development, but there were no people associated with that. So it's a way to think about that. North Carolina is the last one that I'm going to share with you, and then just a couple of closing things, and I'm happy to take questions. North Carolina actually has been struggling with their funding formula. They have also seen legal action against them. In 1718, the General Assembly established a joint legislative task force on reform. The state board actually just approved a comprehensive remedial plan, and it is actually going to be depending on where you want to round, either $5.6 or $5.7 billion for 7 years on top of their current funding to be able to get it back to what their original funding formula required. So the actual structure of the program, they're keeping a lot of the actual formulas intact, but they've realized that over time it had eroded to a point that it really was not fully funding folks the way it should. I'm sorry, I forgot one more. South Carolina is also going through this as well. They have been working on it. There's not been a new formula that has been put out there yet. The new funding has been put out there, but there's not been any action on it. Part of that probably was because of COVID. So if you look at these 4 states and the things that they've done, and especially Texas and Maryland, who had the most extensive change and most deliberate change, arguably they were the ones that had the biggest change on their own initiative, as opposed to it being fully pushed by legal action. You can see these points that they determine a purpose for changing the funding formulas. I mean, I don't mean to sound crass, but I mean, if it's about political expediency and what you can say, you're basically going to be in the same place soon, unless you can articulate exactly why you want to change those funding formulas. They determined priorities for the new structure. They didn't determine the new structure until they determined the priorities. What do we care about as a state? They had to recognize that patience and time are necessary. All of you sitting here, you know what it's like. One of the hardest things to do is to communicate. No matter how much you think you communicate, somebody didn't get the message, right? That's why patience and time are so important. I'll never forget one of my town halls when I was here, and a teacher coming up and saying, "We want more communication from you." And I said, "I'm happy to do it. I send you an email every Monday. What more can I do?" He's like, "Well, I don't read email." I said, "I'm sorry, what?" He said, "Unless it has an interesting subject title." So I considered putting, Purple People Leader or, whatever in the subject line. But, I mean, we know it's just hard to do that. But patience and time are going to be important, because if you change this formula, it's going to take time to get that word out, because in the absence of information, people make stuff up. It's just a human nature. And then finally, and this is the part that's going to be the hardest to hear, especially knowing the liabilities that Kentucky has to deal with right now with regard to retirement and so forth. There's going to have to be a transition time, and an investment will probably be necessary. In other words, when you transition, an initial infusion of funds is probably going to be necessary to at least mitigate districts who in transition may actually see a loss of funding. It probably will bounce back if you do it the right way, but in the immediate, over the first few years, you may actually see where there's a problem. That's why Maryland is doing this over 10 years, so they're spreading out that investment costs farther, so that they can, when they get to where they need to go, most likely some of the funding might be backed off, but at least during the interim, there was not districts that were having to shoulder all of that responsibility. With that, I'm happy to take questions. Hopefully it gave you something that was helpful and needed, mainly because I hope you ask me back another time.
Well, President Pruitt, appreciate your presentation today. You're always welcome here in the Commonwealth, and you have sparked some questions.
Good.
First one is Representative Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I say anything else, I just want to go back to slide 18 and your comment that you needed to apologize to the University of Louisville. I just want to point out that you actually have University of North Carolina colors there in your shade of blue. So you didn't insult Louisville. You've actually irritated every single sports-minded individual in the state of Kentucky. So congratulations on that.
Sorry about that.
Seriously, I want to thank you for your presentation. You've brought some considerations to mind that I know I haven't thought about, and maybe some others have or haven't. But one, it's interesting that we're not alone in the fact that we're recognizing the need to do what we're doing. But more importantly than that, if you've brought up some cautionary notes that we have to keep in mind as we move forward, so that we don't say that we fixed something and simply made it worse. So I appreciate those thoughts as we move forward. Come back anytime, as far as I'm concerned. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll make sure to use better colors next time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Our next question or comment comes from Devonna Page.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Pruitt, thank you again for being here with us today. I was just wondering, in the southern region, are there any of these states that have the add-on as part of the formula? Do they have any mechanism built in to regularly review those add-on calculations to update them to keep pace with inflation?
So again, it sort of depends on how the funding itself works. For the most part, there's not a lot of deliberate times put in there. Although I will tell you that Maryland in particular has put in set benchmarks over this 10-year time period to do additional review. A good example is they put basically a placeholder in for special ed, and frankly, they don't know if it's an appropriate amount of money. So they're running additional funding models over the next year to decide if that needs to be changed and tweaked. Again, I think the good lesson learned from Maryland is they didn't just, do a new fund and say, yay, we're done. They actually have built-in structures to do an ongoing review. I think it's a great idea to do that. But I would also say, this is where it gets really difficult, is just the dynamics of a state education budget. Sometimes you feel like you're chasing your tail as it is. And so I think in an ideal place, yes, you should set that in. The question becomes, what do you do that for? Do you do it just for categorical weighting? Do you do it for, in the case, to use Kentucky terminology, to use it for large items and boss items too? Again, I think that would be based on the priorities that you would set.
Our next question comes from Representative Bojanowski.
Thank you, sir. So my question is just kind of looking at the resource-based funding systems. I'm assuming, is that different than a system where you look at what it would cost to give every child an opportunity to learn and achieve at a certain level? And that kind of boils around, and I've asked this question before, where did our original SEEK number come from? And was it built from what it would cost to give every, as the superintendent before said, every student in our state the highest quality education, or was it just a number we started with?
So I can't give you the answer to that as far as what where the original number came from. I think I may have asked that same question a few times when I was here, and I don't know that I know that. Probably the person to ask on that would probably be Shay or Robin. I don't know though. Chuck, you may know. I don't know, but yeah, but I don't know that anybody knows that number. So, but with the resource issue, this is where it gets weird, okay? Because if you wanted to say, we want to give this cost, or we want to pay for each student to be able to have X, it becomes a little bit of a challenge to think about what would that number look like? Like, how do we really assign that value? And to be perfectly honest with you, I've seen some states in my time in education policy where that was attempted and the number got to be so astronomical they just simply said we can't go any further than that. But the flip side of that is, you've got to start somewhere. So for instance, you've got a teacher salary schedule. Well, you can kind of start with that. Are you happy with that teacher salary schedule, or does that need to be enhanced? I think there's been attempts by multiple states, including Kentucky, to get a better handle on actual cost in classroom. ESSA requires that each district report a per pupil number for what they're being spent per pupil. But Kentucky, just like basically every other state, you get into what do you categorize as in classroom? Do you count the leadership coach or the instructional coach as a classroom person, even though they're not there every day, but yet they act somewhat as administrator? Do you add the co-teacher who is helping with special ed? So I've not seen where a state literally said, let's throw everything out and start with a zero ledger and build it up, because the number can just become astronomical, and not even in the magnitude of the number, but the complexity in getting to the number. Does that make sense? So the resource the resource base that these states use, and probably if you ask them where did their original numbers come from, they're probably going to give you the same answer that Chuck and I did. Well, I'm not real sure where that started, but it's their attempt to assign a value in a current budget structure. Does that make sense?
Next, we have Chuck Truesdale.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'd just like to reiterate what everybody else that I've talked to said. We are so thrilled to have you back in the Commonwealth, and be happy to have you back anytime you would like to make a presentation.
Thank you very much. You've just been waiting to sit up there and ask me a question for 6 years.
I
what
would
it is,
not put it that way. No. I will say, though, it's always good to hear very intelligent people say things that I've been saying. It makes me feel more confident about what I've been saying, which is that if you're going to do any sort of financial reform, fiscal reform, you have to know first what you want to get out of the program, and sort of what do you want the education system to look like. And so I guess my question is, on these 4 states that you were discussing, sort of, do they have any, could you compare and contrast sort of what they thought their expectations were? What were they trying to get out of the education system that they were then trying to fund? And if that's something you can talk about today, great. If not, if you want to send something to the group later, that'd be great. And second, connected with that is, did any of these states develop a methodology or any way to measure all of those expectations? Was there any sort of accountability system connected to the financial portion of things?
So the answer to your first question is, with Texas and Maryland, I think they probably did the best job of identifying what those priorities were. Now, with all due respect to them, I from my little catbird seat, I think there was an aspect that I wish they had considered, and that was what their future workforce should be. I think that we live in a time where if we just think about education through grade 12, that we're going to, as a country, we're going to have some economic problems. I think most of you here have seen the SREB report, where we're predicting we may see as many as 18 million unemployable adults by 2030. Okay, not unemployed, but unemployable. And in Kentucky, I should have looked the number up before I came up here, but I want to say it was right around 650,000 of that 800 million, or that 18 million will be unemployable. The reason that's important in this context is because we need to know what we want our citizenry to look like by 2030. And frankly, COVID, the 8 weeks of shutdown actually accelerated industry dependence on automation by 5 years. So actually, we don't even have to 2030 anymore. So what I wish states would do is say, what do we want our citizenry to look like in terms of their skills and their donations to civic duty? And then back map that to be able to say, how do we get them there? I mean, frankly, there's not going to be a job available after 2030 that's not got some rooting in what people refer to as STEM. I mean, there was a thing on a news station just this week about construction is at an all-time high, but they're having trouble filling positions. And somehow they got back to the idea, well, it's because we don't offer shop classes much. And then finally somebody said, well, actually, it's not that. It's actually the fact that building a house no longer is about hammers and nails. It's about understanding 3D modeling. It's about using, technology to make sure look at, what the horrible thing that happened in Florida a couple weeks ago, right? So I say all that, not to just pontificate, but to say, if we start there and then we start to back map that and say, well, what does that have to do for our economic development and labor? What does it have to do for post-secondary? And when I say post-secondary, to be clear, I mean 4-year college and university. I mean 2-year community college. I mean certification programs that happen right after you come out of school. And then look at your K-12 system. Kentucky is uniquely positioned, and I get that I'm a little biased when it comes to Kentucky, but I usually don't make these kind of statements in public. Kentucky is uniquely positioned to be able to do that potentially better than anybody in the country because of the data system that we have here. Okay? You can look at anything you want to look at with people in Kentucky, whether it be workforce or education or teacher licensure, better than anybody else in the country. So if you can do that and then back map it. As to your issue about accountability, I don't think it's either not present yet or it's not transparent yet. I think especially with Texas and Maryland, it's so new. I don't think they have put those in place yet because they're not sure what that looks like. And let's face it, I mean, that's one of the biggest challenges. I mean, you and I sat in multiple meetings together trying to figure out how do you figure out what's classroom cost. But even that's going to take an investment because you're going to have to get people trained and all that. So I wish I could tell you, yes, there's accountability everywhere, but if there is, it's not obvious.
Thank you. And there are people in this room that will confirm you're preaching to the choir on
I know.
The employability side of things particularly. That we have to figure out sort of what we want our students to look like and what the world they're coming into, we want that to look like before we can figure out what resources we need to use to build that world. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Next question comes from Senator Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Dr. Pruitt, I too second and third everything that's been said about you today. It's good to see you back. I always thought you were an outstanding education commissioner. You did a wonderful job here.
Thank you.
And I'm glad to see that you're prospering now on a grander scale with the Southern Regional Education Board. I want to hit on something that you talked about regarding Maryland's objective, and that is to have a school system that was world class, not just limited to America, world class. Because I've said before that our students of today have to compete worldwide. That when you look at where America is now, if we don't have the talent here, then we recruit it from India or from other nations around the world. And then if we have to do that, then America loses out. And I constantly think about my grandchildren. I've got a granddaughter. I was telling Representative Tipton earlier, I got a granddaughter in 6th grade. I got a grandson who's starting kindergarten now. And so I'm thinking about their education, over the next 12 to 15 years. I've got two thoughts, and tell me what you think. If you disagree, I have no problem with that because you're the expert here. When I look at world-class systems that are often talked about, South Korea, Australia, you hear those countries talked about a lot as having, the preeminent model in this world. They do two things I think where America has to go. One, they have longer school years. I think this whole idea that you get from May to September out is outdated now. We're no longer an agrarian society anymore. Though that concept came when we were an agrarian society. Though they have, I don't say they go year round, but they have intermittent breaks, but they go 10, 11 months a year. I think as Americans, we have to start doing that in our country. Number two, they specialize more. Now, I don't mean that school systems have to have majors now, but if you have a child, you talk about STEM, that's interested in coding, and I go back to my dear colleague Max and my dear colleague Senator Givens, who talks about this a lot. Then we need to start training students to do coding. Or if they want to do dress design, they want to be the next Diane von Furstenberg. Then they can really focus on that. What do you think? Would you support us as Americans really gearing our priorities in our education as we develop the next generation workforce, doing those two things: longer school years and more emphasis in specialization in the K through 12. And I really, to me, it's really more pre-K through 16. It's where I see how I see education in the future. Your comments, please.
Sure. I mean, I will speak a little bit longer to the second one than the first one,
Okay.
but I did actually do a presentation on school year. I think it was in Oklahoma. I don't remember because I do a few of these. And at the end of the day, what the research and data is telling us is what it often does in education. It's less about the time and more about what you do with the time. So there's, because, I mean, block scheduling is a good example. I know when I was in the classroom, they were considering block schedule at my school, and they were like, but you only have to teach 3 classes, and they're 90 minutes. Well, what happens with some people is they still kept teaching for an hour, and then they give them the last 30 minutes to do homework. Well, that's not a good use of that time. And what the research that I've seen has shared is that a longer school year is fine as long as the longer school year is actually utilized. I know that my wife, who I'll brag about, pharmacist for 28 years, and when we moved to Georgia, decided she would finally pursue her dream of being a teacher. So she's now a high school physics teacher. For some reason, she didn't want to be the commissioner's wife in Kentucky. I can't imagine why that'd be, but we moved to Georgia, she did. And now they do have, it's not a year-round calendar, but she has a week off in September, a week off in November for Thanksgiving, the Christmas holidays, and in February. So they go a little bit later. They start, like she starts school on Monday in pre-planning, and they go until the end of May. I do think I see where she's more rested, and I think she's able to kind of decompress a little bit, but that's an end count of 1. The research, what I'm seeing is time in school matters only if you actually do something different in that time in school. The second part, I am actually a big believer in pathways, which is kind of what you're talking about. Now, the thing is, what's incumbent on all educational leaders, though, is to make clear that all those pathways have equal value, and not that, those of you going to college are going to be a little bit better than those of you going into technical college. Mm-hmm. They all have value. Now, I think that it's where you've got to be careful. It's where accountability does matter. One of the places we were moving with our ESSA system here before I left, and I just haven't dug in to see where this is at this point, but, was actually starting to look at, what are we allowing in terms of our master scheduling with students of poverty, students of color, being able to have access to some of these pathways. In Georgia, we've been working with several school districts, the State Department of Education, the equivalent of CPE, and actually a couple of Senate colleagues, and Wellstar. Wellstar is the biggest healthcare provider in the state. Massive nursing shortage in Georgia. And with all those people at the table, we were able to help develop a pathway for these 4 districts in North Georgia where a student starts their nursing in high school. We improved counseling in middle school to give kids a better understanding of what was out there. Through dual enrollment, they leave high school with 26 dual enrollment hours, and they get their CNA, their Certified Nursing Assistant. And this is where I think it diverts a little bit from where we unfortunately see things. Because we had the Technical College System of Georgia and the Board of Regents at the table, all of those hours are guaranteed to transfer to the community college toward a degree. In other words, and we had this problem in Kentucky. A lot of dual enrollment, but it doesn't necessarily count for a degree. And it was great because we had Senator Tippins at the table and we had Wellstar at the table. And whenever somebody started to hedge, they'd say, well, now, if you don't do it, I'm going to pass a law and make you. Or Wellstar would say, if you don't do it, I'm not going to interview your people. Changes the situation. So they graduate with 26. All that goes to the community college or technical college. Then at the technical college, they can then get their LPN and their associate's degree in basically a little over a year. Okay? All of those credits are guaranteed to transfer then to the 4-year where they can get their BSN. They actually end up graduating a year sooner than the average BSN graduate. Less student debt, the opportunity to actually work in hospitals because you have a CNA and then an LPN, but you also have student freedom to be able to say, I'm good with an LPN, I'm happy here, I think I'm going to stop, or I have the option to go forward. We were doing a same thing in a different part of the state with advanced manufacturing. And if you bring people together to have that conversation where kids can see where they're headed, I absolutely believe it's right. But I also believe that specialization has to be across the board and balanced. In Germany back in the 90s, they did not perform well in the PISA science test, and they saw it as a national emergency. They put all kinds of investment in it, and they created this great system. They were graduating scientists and engineers. Then they realized, though, their skilled labor was actually declining. So they then invested a lot of money in that. And some of you have probably even been on a tour of Germany recently where you could see that. Well, some preliminary research that I'm seeing is coming out saying now they're having a shortage of engineers again. So that's why we've got to say specialization is important, but that means you've got to have counselors in middle school. And some of you may remember when I was here, one of the budget items that I asked for was, to increase career counseling starting in middle school and high school. This is not me trying to rehash that, by the way. This is just the data points it out. But starting there and then as a culture deciding, instead of saying, where are you going to college, you ask every kid, so what's next? Because no matter what happens after grade 12, if grade 12 is your terminal degree, it's terminal for you as a workforce. Okay? So I do believe in specialization. I just believe that we got to counsel kids so they have the ability to see where their aptitudes are, and we don't track kids into certain places because as I think I've shared with this committee before, if I had listened to my high school counselor who told me I probably shouldn't go to college because, I wasn't probably college material, despite my GPA, despite having 2 college graduates for parents, I was bussed in because of a deseg rule, and she just didn't think I was quite there. And I've more than once wished she was still alive so I could give her my business card. But we got to find a way to not track kids. But I do think that if we put in the right guidance structure across the board, we can really help kids specialize and get them into careers that matter. And that's the other part that Kentucky has over everybody. With what we know about how the job market is in Kentucky, and the fact that we can drill down into 8 different regions in the state, there aren't many states that can do that. We can find a way to get credentials of value, and that includes college degrees as well as industry licensure to get them into the workforce. Probably a much longer answer than you wanted, but I couldn't help myself.
Our final question and comment today will come from Co-Chair Wise.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner, Director, I'm sorry. Thank you for being here. I always appreciate your wisdom and your friendship more than anything.
Thank you.
Really quick, I know we've gone past the 3 o'clock hour, but one direct question, one hypothetical. The direct question, with SREB and also with your time traveling, as states look at Kentucky with SEEK and with funding, do most say it's a good model? They've already got it in place. And then the hypothetical on top of that, if you were in the position as commissioner, was there times you wanted to make changes and tweaks, and is this the right time? We will make recommendations. We don't know after this what will come of this group. We have no idea, legislatively or not. But is there areas there of changes and tweaks you see, would you have done? And then our reputation of what we currently have with other states? Thank you.
So I would say to the first question, I believe that Kentucky holds up well, even though the system was set up in the 90s. It's hard to know, I think, when you've lived here for a long time, but the fact that I came here from a different place and now that I've left and I'm kind of got this bird's eye view of things, Kentucky is held in really high esteem in terms of how education has been handled since the 90s. And I know that there are some people who are like, Kara didn't work or Kara is dead or whatever. And I do actually find it sort of sad when that happens, because when you look at it's like I used to say this when I was here. I didn't come here to be middle of the road. I wanted to be top. But I also know getting to the top is a marathon more so than a sprint. When I hear people speak outside of Kentucky, there is always in particular when the idea of funding comes up, there's generally a lot of positivity around it. So I believe that it's a solid place to be. And I found it when I was here to be something that was, in fact, I was asked by several of your colleagues, is it time for us to change things? And I was always a little hesitant about changing it because it had shown growth. I mean, it would have been, now, given the funding formula in and of itself isn't what changed Kentucky, but it was part of what changed Kentucky. So I found it as commissioner, and I find it as SREB president, to be a system that people see as still having a lot of positive pieces. As far as your hypothetical goes, here's where you get into opinion. So I did not find SEEK in and of itself to be something that I ever really wanted to tweak a whole lot. The things that I probably tended to be a little bit more willing to talk about, and understand when I say what I'm about to say, I'm not saying this is a recommendation, but it was something I felt like we should talk about, was more around how districts can deal with the optional nickel, and how it's fairly easy for that to be derailed at the local level. And so, out of one side of your mouth, you can't say, well, our school system's not doing well and we don't have the facilities or anything else we need, but out of the other side say, but I'm signing this petition to prevent you from raising the tax by a nickel. I found that to be something that was at least worthy of a conversation. But the actual system in and of itself, the formula in and of itself, I actually didn't have any real concerns with it.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate you being here today.
Thank you.
President Pruitt, I appreciate your presentation today, and please express our appreciation to your staff.
Absolutely.
They're always very professional and very helpful anytime I've ever had to call on them. I want to thank all the members of the task force presenters today. This is a lot of information to take in, but a very important topic that we need to discuss. Our next meeting, the task force, is scheduled for Monday, August the 9th. Only 3 weeks.
And thanks to Josh. He did a whole lot of...
Absolutely. Our staff, yes. We've got great staff here in Kentucky. Appreciate you reminding me of that. Josh, you need to remind me of that sometimes.